In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night.
Hello everyone, I am Anthropomantic Fiend and I do horror-related things on the internet. Today I am reviewing yet another black and white horror movie, this time yet another one from the 1960s, and starring Christopher Lee. This is Horror Hotel, which came out 1960. This follows a girl who is, I believe, a college student who has decided to research witchcraft for her term paper or whatever it is that she's doing. She's been talking to her history professor, played by Christopher Lee, who has told her about this nearby town Whitewood, which was part of witch trials and notably witchy goings on, and she's interested in doing her paper based on what info she can get from Whitewood. So she goes there. The creepy, devilish, witchy goings on are not in the past, and things are not quite as they seem, and of course things are set up to go horribly wrong, and they do. As I mentioned, Christopher Lee is in this. He plays this history professor. He's very Christopher Lee. He's very commanding and stern, and he's very, very upfront with his belief in witchcraft. When someone will tell him it's all just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, he will get very, very angry, and it's just very classic Christopher Lee, and I couldn't have asked for more from him. He's just great in this movie. The girl, Nan Barlow, is very much a straight-ahead, sort of innocent, curious character. She's likable. There's not a lot to her, though. There's sort of some assumptions and story elements that I did not like that I need to get into the story that apply to her, as well as most of the other characters, though. But I first sort of heard some of it from her, so that's why it's down with characters. At the very beginning of the movie, we have, these opening shots of Whitewood back during the witch trials. All the characters there are rather as to be expected. We've got these very stern Puritans and this witch that they're burning at the stake, and it's as can be expected from this kind of movie, which I will get more into in the story aspect, but it's very, very sort of stereotypical in some ways. When Nan goes to Whitewood, she meets this hitchhiker who she picks up, and he's very instantly suspicious and creepy. Basically all the townsfolk are creepy in some way. One of them is a priest at this church. The others are sort of creepy in this menacing way. He's very, very sort of turn back while you still can. Very over the top in that way. He's just like, Satan is looming over this town, turn back while you still can. He reminded me of this gothic horror equivalent of Crazy Ralph from Friday the 13th in some ways. That's just the vibe I got from him, so I enjoyed his over-the-top warning type character. In the inn that Nan goes to stay at, I think it's called the Raven's Inn, there is a mute servant character. At this point, there's just been so many mute servant characters in these movies that's just wow, another one. Because there was one in at least 3 of those Bela Lugosi movies I reviewed. Oh my god. It's just so many mute servant characters. It's kind of like a thing in these movies, but this is Lottie, and she was actually very standout for me because she knows about the horrible dark side of this town, and she really wants to tell people about it, but she's kind of under the watchful eye of the evil lurking in the town, and she can't say anything, so she has to try to find other ways to communicate it. She just seems kind of strange for a little while, but we get more hints that she's just very, very nervous and desperate, and she's a very tragic character. I really liked her performance. She just seems very scared and desperate and tragic and can't communicate the horrors of this little town to anybody. So I really liked Lottie. There's also Nan's boyfriend. He's kind of bland. There's not really much to him except that he's kind of this upstanding nice guy who's a scientist and doesn't believe in all this witchy mumbo jumbo but cares about her. So he was well acted, but there wasn't a lot to him that was interesting. We also meet one of his school friends who's even less interesting, and then there's just all the cool spooky townsfolk, and that's more or less the cast of the movie. There is one member of the townsfolk who is not as spooky, who is Pat, who runs this bookstore in the town and is the daughter of the God-fearing priest old man who I mentioned earlier, and she is absolutely just a sweetheart and a really nice person. And again, she's not very fleshed out, but she's likable. Other than that, there is one other character that I really did enjoy. He's very much a bit part of the movie, and that's this old man who they meet on the way to Whitewood, who's just like, you going to Whitewood? I wouldn't go that way if I were you, but it's just this way. He's sort of like Crazy Ralph in that way too, but he's not this sort of you're all doomed character. He's this, I don't know. Later on, after Nan has gone to Whitewood, her boyfriend and his friend go to Whitewood as well, and they pass him by. There's just this series of shots of a bunch of people passing him by and asking for the way to Whitewood, and he's just, another one? It was just really funny to me. He's really funny to me. All the characters in this movie were either likable or enjoyable, if not the most fleshed out characters in the world. The music is a really interesting vibe. It mixes this classic gothic horror traditional score with like this Latin chanting in it, which was a nice touch, with elements of jazz, and there are just like straight up jazz numbers sprinkled throughout the score as like background music in different scenes. And the actual score and the jazz music were composed by different people, which adds an interesting dynamic. But at the same time, in the traditional gothic horror score, there are elements of jazz, which was cool. And like I said, the story has probably my biggest problem with the movie in it, which is this whole witch trial angle, which implies that the women who were burned at the stake as witches were actually malevolent witches, and I hate that. I hate that so much. I like the malicious witchy things that happen in this movie, but I do not like that angle. It's similar to my problem with The Conjuring, which is honestly worse, because that movie is based more or less on facts, or things that are supposed to have actually happened. In that movie, what's behind the goings-on in the house is that there is this woman who was accused of being a witch and hung herself on this tree and apparently cursed everyone there, and the implication that she was an actual witch and she's the reason for all this stuff that supposedly actually happened is not okay, because so many innocent people were accused of being witches and burned. To say that these people who suffered needlessly were actually malevolent witches is disgusting, and I hate it. So that's a thing in this movie, but you know, that said, I liked the evil witches in this movie, and honestly the opening of this movie with this witch being burned at the stake and sort of laughing as she burned and calling out to Lucifer reminds me of all things Hocus Pocus, because it really is that same kind of prologue and has a similar follow-up in some ways. Another modern connection I thought of when talking about the story was Midsommar, because I watched that recently and I'm beginning to think that going to the old places with the dark histories and occult goings on to do your research papers is not a good move. And yeah, hated the witch trials angle, liked the actual spookiness of the movie, because it's very sort of in the tradition of Hammer movies like The Devil Rides Out and that sort of thing, doing this very fictionalized version of Satanism or devil worship that is obviously a concoction of the writer, but is very melodramatic and spooky in a way that's fun. So that said, the lead ups to the more in your face creepy things are very subtle. This movie has more of a slow build to it where you're not entirely sure what's going on, and it's just very dark and macabre and mysterious and ambient. Builds this great atmosphere. I really liked the little things that happen that make things seem slightly off, that might not mean anything, but just give you enough of a taste of what creepy stuff is going to happen. I liked the atmosphere and the subtlety, and I liked the melodrama later on. The visuals in this movie absolutely do add to the atmosphere. The camera work is not anything particularly weird or artsy, but the movie looks great and very, very stylish. And the sets and costumes look great. I enjoyed the period stuff in the prologue as well as the contemporary 60s stuff, because everybody's usually in a suit or something. It's very elegant and I liked it. When we're in Whitewood, everything is just shrouded in this fog, and I absolutely love the fog. There's a fog-shrouded cemetery, and it's gorgeous. I love the sets on this movie. They're so, so pretty. If I didn't know better and didn't know what was probably going to happen to me if I lived in Whitewood, I would absolutely want to live there because it looks beautiful, even though I know it is not a real place. Very, very gorgeous sets. Not just the exteriors of Whitewood, but then the Raven's Inn is just sort of lit where it's draped in shadow, and then there's this fireplace that illuminates the room, and there's just flickering shadows cast over everything. So the lighting in this movie is gorgeous as well. It's just this very traditional gothic horror, shadowy, creepy atmosphere that is everything that I like. So from a visual standpoint, this movie is beautiful and I love it. And then there's a little bit of editing that I really enjoyed that I can't talk about until the spoilers, but there's a scene where it's a matching shot of one thing that happens to another thing that happens that's just flawless and works so well, and I loved it. So overall, while there's sort of this underlying implication in the movie that was gross, other than that, I think it's a really solid, beautiful looking horror movie, and it's got Christopher Lee in it, so what's not to like there? I think if you like gothic horror, you will love this movie. So I highly recommend checking out Horror Hotel from 1960 if you are into gothic horror. That is the spoiler-free section of my review of Horror Hotel. Here are the spoilers. Back in the witch trials, we've learned about this woman who is burned at the stake and is sort of laughing, and we don't know why. And then there's a guy in the crowd who everybody's just sort of been like, have you been consorting with a witch? And he's like, no. And they're like, okay, we believe him for whatever reason. But they can't believe anything she says, so whatever. But it turns out they are actually both witches, and he's just going, Lucifer, help her. His name is Jethro Keen. Jethro is just the most Puritan sounding name ever. I don't know. But then the hitchhiker I mentioned earlier, who's very, very shady, very earlier on, he tells his name to her, which is Jethro Keen. So he has somehow found a way to survive over the years and is now living in the town. While Nan is in her room, she starts to hear this music, this Latin chanting under the floorboards, and she's like, what the hell is going on? The woman who runs Raven's Inn is like, it's nothing, and there's a trap door down there. And so they're like, so you see there's no handle on it? If there was a reason to go down there, there'd be a handle on it. And it's just like, oh my god, could you be any less suspicious right now? Because it's just like, there is a trap door, and yet you're telling her there's nothing down there, and she's just heard music, and you're drawing attention to this suspicious trap door in her floor that has no handle. And if you're trying to hide what you're doing, you're not doing it well. Nan, when she goes to Pat's bookstore and picks up this book on devil worship and starts reading it, she starts reading it out loud in front of this woman and starts going, on February 1st, Candlemas Eve, which is the day that it is, I should mention, so many years ago, the witches would hold a mockery of the Christian church traditions, and they did it in the cellars of Raven's Inn. They would take something personal of the person who they intended to sacrifice and sacrifice them at hour 13, which is apparently a thing, on the altar underneath Raven's Inn. And it's just like, she's just reading what's about to happen to her, and you just know that's what's going to happen to her right then and there, because it's just like, oh my god, you're in Raven's Inn, it's February 1st, it's right there in front of you, just wake up. And sure enough, she hears the chanting again, and she goes downstairs and gets dragged by these black-robed cultists onto this altar and starts screaming, and apparently their clocks do strike 13 on this day. They start counting, and she starts screaming to this woman who runs the inn, who is apparently a cultist, but then she reveals herself as Elizabeth, what's her name, the witch who was burned at the stake years and years and years ago. So that's where sort of the hocus pocus thing comes in. She is that witch survived all these years, or reincarnation somehow, and it's just right there. This is where the matched cut that I really liked comes in, because she just plunges this dagger down towards Nan, and then it cuts to this knife being cut into a cake at this party that the two guys are at, that she's supposed to be attending after she gets back from Whitewood. So it's just one of those perfect cuts from a horrific thing to a casual thing. Perfect matched cut right there. I loved the editing in that scene. Shortly after that, these guys call on Christopher Lee's professor character, because he's the one who sent Nan to Whitewood, and when we see what he's doing when the phone call comes, he is in this big cloak with a dagger, and he's got a bird, and he's just like, accept this sacrifice, O Lord of Light, and plunges it into him, and he's just like, oh, the phone's ringing, and he starts washing his hands in this, he's got like a gargoyle in his room that has like water coming out of its mouth, so he's washing his hands using a gargoyle, and then hiding it all behind this curtain, taking off his cloak to reveal his business suit, and then going to check in with these people. So it might have been the doorbell, not the phone. I think it was the doorbell. But anyway, just his casual little bit of devil worship behind this curtain is very menacing Christopher Lee, but also absolutely hilarious to me, because it's just, casually washing your hands with this freaking gargoyle, which was great to me. We also sort of realized that the old priest man who I mentioned, who's Pat's father, he is blind, and Lottie is mute, aside from Pat, who is the old man's daughter. The only two people in this town who are not part of this cult have been somehow inhibited, either mute or blind, and it's even revealed later on, because I kind of guessed it, that they were the descendants of the Puritans who burned Elizabeth and Jethro, so they've been cursed, which makes me wonder why Pat doesn't have any of that, but following that, the two other guys wind up coming to Whitewood, and one of them, it's so weird, just ends up seeing Elizabeth cackling, burning at the stake in front of him, and crashes into that, and for literally no reason, and you think he's dead, but he just comes out of the car all beaten up and appears later randomly to help things out. And then the one other death in the movie, which was truly the most heartbreaking scene in the movie, was Lottie, who is like, I can't take it anymore, and starts writing this message to the guys to tell them about the witches, but before she can get a chance, Elizabeth and Jethro come into her room, strangle her to death, and she's just trying to scream, and she's mute and she also can't breathe because she's being choked, and it's hard to watch and it's heartbreaking. So that was really well done and really heartbreaking. At the very end of the movie, this is another ritual day. It's the witch's Sabbath, and we get another ritual, and it's just like, we're doing this again, okay? And it's the exact same ritual, except this time it's with Pat, and the guys are running to her rescue, and they end up chasing the cultists out to the cemetery, and the old man has told them, it's the sign of the cross that you need to look out for. That is the only thing that can help you. So finally, at the very last moment, the guy who's had the car crash just hobbles over to this cross tombstone and uproots it and starts holding it out at the cultists and saying stuff, and they start bursting into flame and screaming, and it's hysterical. I could not take it seriously. It was too funny. They all escape at the last minute while all of the cultists get set on fire, and oh my god, it was a little ridiculous, but it was fun. Overall, this movie's got some serious problems, but it has a beautiful atmosphere, and I really enjoyed watching it. So if you like gothic horror, I highly recommend checking out Horror Hotel. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I'll see you in another one. Bye.